Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. We have a number of thank yous. A lot of people worked to put this program on. Executive Dean David Scobie at the New School for Public Engagement, the Nation Institute, Nation Books and Magazine, Haymarket Books, The Guardian, all sort of really worked to make tonight possible. We obviously have a special thank you both to all of you who came out tonight and all of the people who are watching this. The event is being live streamed, and it is also being taped by Book TV, for Book TV and Free Speech TV. So I would ask to everybody to check their cell phones just to make sure that your cell phone is off, and also just so you know that it is being filmed tonight. We will be taking questions later and passing around note cards and then reading the questions from up here so that they can also be part of the live stream and the Book TV. And there will be a book signing afterwards. Haymarket Books has a table and Gary will be signing books, so please join us afterwards. So this weekend I went to DC and I had a couple of extra hours, and so I went to see the King Memorial. How many people have seen the King Memorial? It's exceedingly depressing. The original plans for the monument included alcoves to honor other civil rights martyrs, but those were scrapped for insufficient funds. King towers over us. The sculpture is flanked by a granite wall. 14 quotes are on that wall. Not one uses the word racism or segregation or racial injustice or apartheid, not one. They're arranged like cross stitches, 1963, 1967, 1955, 1963, 1964, completely out of context of the movements and mobilizations in which King spoke them. The monument was made in China to save money. A man who excoriated the triple evils of materialism, militarism, and racism, who risked his life and went to jail 30 times to challenge the scourge of American racism, who was quick to point out the racism of the North as well as the South, who wrote from jail in 1963 that the biggest problem was not the Klan, but the white moderate. That man of God and courage is now honored with a memorial that refuses to speak the problem of racism. It is into this moment when the history of the civil rights movement is regularly invoked and distorted and used to celebrate the greatness of the United States, that we turn to our speakers tonight. Both of tonight's speakers write eloquently to help us make sense of this paradox, of these perilous times we live in, where the history of one of the greatest social movements of the 20th century is used to imperil any urgency of the task of social justice today. Indeed, to cover up, at times, the continuing scourge of materialism, militarism, and racism. And yet, of the visions we can gain from a fuller and much richer sense of that history to help us see and work for justice in our time. Michael Denzel Smith is a blogger at thenation.com and a Nobler Fellow at the Nation Institute. He is also a freelance writer and social commentator, and his work has appeared in places such as The Guardian, Ebony, The Griot, The Root, and The Huffington Post. Gary Younge is author, broadcaster, and award-winning columnist at The Guardian, a monthly columnist at The Nation, and a Nobler Fellow at the Nation Institute. He has written 4 books. His 4th book, The Speech, the story behind Martin Luther King's dream, is why we are here tonight, as Gary gives us a bit of the fuller history of the March on Washington and then reflects on the current politics of this civil rights history and our recent season of memorialization. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary to kind of give us some introductory remarks, and then Michael, and then we'll have some conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to questions and conversation with you. Thank you.
So thanks very much for coming. For those who've never seen me before, I'm Gary Younge. For those who have seen me before, I'm Gary Younge in a suit, because this is not a particularly familiar sight unless you've seen me at a wedding or a funeral. So the book is called The Speech, and it's about King's famous speech at the March on Washington. And if left there as an idea, then you have a great man and a great talk. But King could not do that on its own. The speech and the march came from somewhere. And I want to start by giving some context to that text, because in the absence of that, there would have been no march and there would have been no speech. And so I start with kind of some of the people whose names perhaps we don't know, but who paid for that speech in a range of ways. And I begin with Franklin McCain, who was a 17-year-old in Greensboro, North Carolina, who made his stand by taking his seat at the Woolworths downtown on February the 1st, 1960. When I interviewed Franklin McCain, he said that up until that time, as a young man in North Carolina, he felt that his life was worthless and that his parents had lied to him. And the lie that they told him was a great American lie that you can be anything you want to be. And he said, as he grew through adolescence, he knew that wasn't true. As a 17-year-old black male in North Carolina, he knew that that wasn't true. And just as a symbol of how untrue that was, a completely different story that I was doing, several years later, I interviewed a guy called Buford Posey from Mississippi, a white guy who became an anti-racist, who told me, quite kind of matter-of-factly, he said, I never knew that it was illegal to kill a black man until I joined the army. He said, until that time, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know it was illegal. And true enough, in Mississippi, the people who were as likely as not to be killing black people were actually the law enforcement agencies. So it was not an entirely incredible thing for him to think. So if we go back to Franklin McCain, he knows this as well as Buford Posey does. And he says he was angry at his parents for this lie. And so they sat up, him and his friends, late into the night, January 31st, talking about how everybody had failed them before they talked themselves into the action that they took the following day, not knowing when they showed up at Woolworths in Greensboro whether any of the others would be there. He says, we wanted to go beyond what our parents had done, and the worst thing that could happen was that the Klan could kill us. But I had no concern for my personal safety. The day I sat at that counter, I had the most tremendous feeling of elation and celebration. I felt that in this life, nothing else mattered. If there's a heaven, I got there for a few minutes. I just felt you can't touch me. You can't hurt me. There's no other experience like it, not even the birth of my first child. A few years later, in May '63, in Birmingham, Alabama, a burly white police officer attempted to intimidate some black school children to keep them from joining the growing anti-segregation protests. They assured him they knew what they were doing, ignored his entreaties, and continued their march toward Kelly Ingram Park, where they were arrested. A reporter asked one of them her age. 6, she said, as she climbed into the paddy wagon. The following month in Mississippi, stalwart civil rights campaigner Fannie Lou Hamer overheard Annelle Ponder, a fellow activist, being beaten in jail in an adjacent cell. Can you say yes, sir, nigger? Can you say yes, sir, the policeman demanded. Yes, I can, replied Ponder. So say it. I don't know you well enough, said Ponder. And then Hamer heard her head hit the floor again. The Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski once wrote, all books about all revolutions begin with a chapter that describes the decay of tottering authority or the misery and sufferings of the people. But they should begin with a psychological chapter, one that shows how a harassed, terrified man suddenly breaks his terror and stops being afraid. This unusual process demands illuminating. Man gets rid of fear and feels free. The period preceding King's speech at the March on Washington was one such chapter. Until that point, there had, of course, been many fearless acts by anti-racist protesters, but in that moment, the number who were prepared to commit them reached a critical mass. In May '63, the New York Times published more stories about civil rights in 2 weeks than it had in the previous 2 years. During the 10-week period following Kennedy's address on civil rights in June that year, there were 758 demonstrations in 186 cities, resulting in 14,733 arrests. Such were the conditions that made the March on Washington possible and King's speech so resonant. And this context was global. 2 days after McCain made his protest in Greensboro, the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan addressed the South African Parliament in Cape Town with an ominous warning. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, he said, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. Some, including his immediate